fat? That's the question we are going to discuss. This is a big topic and we cannot discuss everything in a one go. So what we have thought is like, let's first of all understand the reasons why do we get fat. So in this first 20-25 minutes, we will discuss the reasons for that. The first point which I would like to tell, like why OrthoTV decided to have a healthy lifestyle initiative. This is a very important and pertinent question. And the reason is that because in my practice as a pediatric orthopedic surgeon, I see children like this. Previously, before 2 decades, it was very rare to see such children. But nowadays, almost 20 to 40% of my patients are more or less like that. When I go to a college, I see girls and boys who are overweight or obese. And if you go outside, you see a people like this. And if you look at the statistics, the recent article published in Annals of Neuroscience 2020, that says that the obesity prevalence in urban India is 44%. That's really big number. 2% out of 5 is overweight or obese. And I jokingly say that those who are seen this advertisement that was very popular in 1980, Hum Do, Hamare Do, the government was trying to popularize this theme for controlling the population of India. Now, if we have to have this advertisement in recent time, then advertisement look like this. The reason is because the weight and the size of people have changed. A lot of people must be thinking that what as an orthopedic surgeon, I am going to speak on this topic. So let me tell you that I have a very little personal experience about weight reduction or maintaining my weight. I have suggested to few people and they have also got benefit. But most of my knowledge is from the giants, from the luminaries like Professor David Ludwig. He has published many articles. In addition to that, for non-medical person, he has written such books which are really interesting. And most of the things which I'm going to share are from his research article or from the books. In addition to that, I must say that I am standing on the shoulder of giants like Jason Fung, a nephrologist, the author of Obesity Code and Diabetes Code, the Robert Lustig, another popular person from San Francisco, and a person who is telling us very strongly that avoid sugar in your daily meal. Ben Bickman and Eric Westman, these are the people whose books or the articles have probably made us to understand this problem. So let's understand the popular paradigm. This is a concept which has been told to us for last 3-4 decades. And the concept is very simple, that you take calories and you consume calories. Whatever is the difference, that's going to decide the outcome. So let's say that if you look at from the finance perspective, your income minus expenditure decides your savings. The same way, if you consume 2000 calories and use 1800 calories, then there will be a surplus of 200 calories, and that will be stored in our body as a fat. On the other hand, if you consume more, there will be a deficit of 400 calories, and that will result into loss of weight. So based on that, if we eat more and exercise less, then we have a weight gain. And for weight loss, it's indirectly said that eat less and move more, carry out more exercise. I'm sure that there are a lot of people in the audience who have tried this. They have probably got a success for a short time, but ultimately they regain weight. And in spite of so much of propaganda by so many government authorities in USA and India, if you look at in last few decades, this is how we have progressed. If you look at the person on the left, that was a picture of 1960s, 1950s, And if you look at the picture on the right, we have really put on weight around our waist. And the most shocking thing for me is like, this is my patient who was born with a clubfoot and he's a 6-year child and he's already overweight. This is another 10-year-old boy weighing 65 kilograms. And he came to me because there was no one ready to give anesthesia because of so much weight. So such patients we see in our practice very routinely. And that really made me to think about this problem. So the problem which we saw, calorie in and calorie out concept, is not actually solving the issue. So this Professor David Ludwig suggested a different model, and we are going to understand this model in a very simple understanding. I will be using very less technical terms so that even non-medical person can understand that. So that model is called carbohydrate insulin model. In the YouTube, we have shared the link for this article, and you can download this article freely from the journal site. So just go to the YouTube link and you will be able to get a quick link from which you will be able to download this article. So let us understand what is the concept. First of all, I will give you an analogy, and this analogy is something like a person who is earning a 2 lakhs rupees per month. David, please excuse me, I am using the terminology which is very popular in India. So 2 lakhs is 200,000 rupees. Of that, the person is using 1,50,000 as a household expense, the day-to-day expense. And the remaining 50,000 goes for savings. So that's the normal situation. If something goes wrong, and in this case, of this 2 lakhs rupees, the 1,50,000 goes for savings. In that case, only 50,000 will remain for household expense. And that will result into a liquidity crunch or a cash crunch. There is not enough money for day-to-day expense. And this will force that person or that family to search for an extra income so that they can make 2 ends together. Now, let's come this to a medical perspective. What happens? In certain people who are lean, in that case, whatever energy they get from the meal, majority of the energy is used for activity of daily living. That is for running, walking, taking bath, or for breathing, or for heart function. That's the routine activity which is person is doing. A very small amount is actually go for a storage, and that storage is mainly for a situation where there is not enough food, the body can survive. So that's really a normal situation or a good situation. However, in recent past, and particularly in some people, the things go slightly differently. And in those patients, the energy from the meal goes, large amount of this goes for a storage, and small proportion goes for activity of daily living. So what happens that because the various organs, muscles, brain, heart, lungs, they are not getting adequate energy. And because of that, they are calorie or energy deprived. And because of that, the person feels tired, he feels constantly hungry. And many of these people are always hungry. I'm sure that you must have seen people like this lady. She says that I have to eat every 2 hours. The reason is because large portion of what they are consuming is going for the fat storage, and very little amount is available for activity of daily living. And because of that, they are always hungry. What happens? Because they are hungry, and hunger is one emotions which we cannot control, and ultimately they eat more. And when they eat more, the same vicious cycle continue, and that results into expansion of our storage. So this is what Professor Ludwig explained in that article, which I explain you in a very simple way. Now, the question which we must be thinking, or we must have in our mind, that why this situation has changed all of a sudden. What has happened in last 3 decades? Because of that, the things are going more towards storage and our waistline is expanding. So let us understand the theory slightly in more detail. According to that theory, it's because of the insulin which is released in response to food. That is the result. So we know that when we eat carbohydrate, the body produces insulin. And when this insulin production is more, the problem takes place. To understand that, first of all, let us understand the function of insulin. Insulin is very important because whenever we consume a meal, on this graph, on our x-axis, we have shown a time, and on a y-axis, we have shown a glucose level. So like a person, basal glucose level is at this horizontal line. After consumption of a meal which contains carbohydrate, and glucose will be released, so it will go up and there will be a spike of blood glucose. We know that hyperglycemia is bad for the various tissues of the body, and for that, body has a mechanism and it produces insulin from the pancreas. This insulin does a wonder and it reduces the blood sugar level. How does it carries out that? It transfers this glucose into the liver where it's stored as a glycogen. It sends this glucose into the muscle where it's stored as as a glycogen, and ultimately it transfers this to the fat storage where it is used. So that's a good function of insulin, which is very important. But we need to understand that insulin has something more, and that is responsible for this fat storage. And that's what the carbohydrate insulin model suggests. So to understand that, let's take this water tank concept. This water tank has an inlet and an outlet. To control this inlet and outlet, there are two valves. This blue valve controls the inlet and this yellow valve controls the outlet. Now, if we want to fill tank, what we need to do? We need to open the inlet and we need to close the outlet. And this is how the water will come in the tank and the tank will be filled. If we want to empty the tank, we need to do reverse. We need to close the inlet and open the outlet so that the water is drained from the outlet and the tank will be empty. Okay, so now let's understand that how this happens in the body and how insulin is playing a role. So insulin in our body opens the entry of fat storage. So whatever extra glucose is there is saved in a fat storage in the form of fat. So that's good thing. But the next thing which happens with insulin, which is really a problem, that insulin closes the exit. So whenever insulin is there and body fat tries to go out of the fat storage, the exit cannot take place because the exit valve is closed by insulin. So insulin opens the entry of fat storage and it closes the exit. And so that results into expansion of the fat storage. And gradually we go on putting weight. It's very slow. Sometimes in most of the patients or most of the people, it's around 1 kilogram every year they put on. So it's very slow speed, but these things go on happening and ultimately we put on weight. Let's understand the next point, like how our food decides the insulin release. We know that in food, we have 3 components, the macronutrients. The first is carbohydrate, the second is protein, and the third is fat. Each carries out a different mechanism or different level of insulin secretions. Let's take the first carbohydrate. In that we have sugar and a starch without fibers. So this is something like the processed food which we are eating that results into a massive spike of insulin after the meal. On the other hand, when we consume the carbs which has a inherent fibers with that, which is called in other medical term a low glycemic index food, in that case the spike of the insulin will be a smaller magnitude. If we compare the previous one, when we consume a sugar or a carbs without fiber, which is called a high glycemic index food, there is a massive surge of insulin. While with the low glycemic food, that insulin release or insulin secretion is less. On the other hand, if we consume protein like cheese, paneer, tofu, or eggs, in that case, the insulin secretion is very minimal. And the fat like a cream, ghee, butter, which has a larger portion of fat and it does not produce insulin at all. So in nutshell, it's basically the carbs, which is called a high glycemic index food, which is leading to a massive surge of insulin. And that results into opening of the fat storage, the energy accumulates and it cannot come out. So what has happened in last few decades? We are consuming more sugar. There is no question that our consumption is more than 3 to 4 times the recommended daily sugar intake, which is around 20 to 25 grams per day. Instead of that, we are consuming around 90 grams of sugar every day. We are taking more carbs in our diet. And what is the reason? The reason is our eat less fat concept, which became very popular in 1980 and 1990s. And that resulted into this problem. So let us understand how that concept really caused a havoc. Before this eat less fat concept, if we are consuming fat, protein, and carbs in this proportion, this is approximate. However, with this eat less fat concept, the media, the medical community, they suggested us to consume less fat. So the total calorie remains same, but the amount which we are getting from fat is reduced. The protein part remains the same, and the remaining component of the food is being by carbs. And now we can understand that when we eat more carbs, particularly the processed food without fibers, that results into a massive insulin surge after meal, which remains for a long period, and that results into expansion of the fat storage. So this is one reason why we are becoming fat. The third reason is that we have increased consumption of processed food. The processed food are devoid of fibers. And because of that, when we consume that without fibers, or in other words, a high glycemic index food, there is a rapid, this carbs are digested into glucose, and that results into a massive secretion of insulin. So processed food are like bread, pizza, burger, cereals, or biscuits. And I'm sure that in addition to that, we have a roti, parotha, khakra, bhakri, all these things which we consume, they have a high amount of high glycemic index food or carbs, and that leads to a massive surge of insulin. And that is one of the reasons of increasing prevalence of obesity in the society. In addition to that, we are frequently eating. Before a few years, there was a concept that eat something every 2 hours. And because of that, previously we used to have only 3 things, the breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then now we have at around 11, we have a tea with some biscuits. Similarly, in the evening, between lunch and dinner, we have tea, and then we have something to eat. So every time we eat, frequently we eat, there is a frequent insulin secretions, and that opens the entry of the fat storage and close the exit. So that is another reason of increasing the obesity. The two last additional factors, that is stress, and the last is sleep deprivation. Most of us are sleeping less than 6 to 8 hours because now we have so many things to do. There are so good TV serial that we have to like watch them on the Netflix till 11, till 12 night, and then ultimately we compromise the sleep. And all this results into, so these 6 factors, the sugary food, more carbs, diet which is poor in fibers, or in other words, processed food, frequent eating, stress, and inadequate sleep results into obesity. So this is what the current understanding of why obesity is increasing. So at this stage, for this session, I would stop. In future, we are going to understand few things about how to reduce weight. So we are going to continue these sessions every 3 or 4 weeks. We are going to cover some aspects related to overweight and obesity. So now if you have any questions related to this lecture or any questions related to overweight or obesity, you can WhatsApp your question to Kapil or to me. These are the 2 numbers. Please note down this number and you can WhatsApp your question. And after that, now we are going to spend half an hour or even more times with Professor David Ludwig. So I stop here and we will have few interaction with us. Thank you. Over to you, Kapil.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dhiren. That was indeed a very lucid kind of a description of what leads to obesity. And I think we've all gained from that talk. So I think to start with, Dr. Ludwig, I would ask you, Dr. Dhiren said that it's the carbs that you want to avoid, and the protein has a limited amount of kind of a portion of what you can consume in a day. And largely we should be looking at the fat because that doesn't spike our insulin. But when I see the food that's available for us, it's really the carbs which are the carb-rich food which is available. And the fat is just kind of an additive that you can add to the food, like oils, or you can add it as a dressing, or you add some cheese onto it. Or so what would be your recommendation really? How do we get more fats into our diet?
Well, namaskar. And thank you, Dr. Dhiren, that was a really exceptionally clear talk. You had said to me earlier that some of the scientific articles seem difficult, but you just analyzed them beautifully. So very nice introduction. And maybe just before I come to your question, just to summarize the foundation here. The usual way of thinking about obesity is that we overeat because the food is so tasty, and we eat more than we burn off, and that gets forced into fat cells, and then we gain weight. But the problem is that the approach, if that were right, the approach is pretty easy. Just eat less and move more, right? And you don't have to make a very big change. Just, you reduce the portions by 10%, you do about 10% more physical activity, and the problem should be solved. But that's not what happens. When people cut back on calories, they start losing weight, but the body fights back. We know this, right? You start getting hungry even before a person with obesity gets anywhere near an ideal body weight. So we start getting hungry, and that gets hard to resist. And our metabolism starts slowing down. So you have to keep eating less and less and less, even as you get hungrier and hungrier and hungrier. Something doesn't make sense there. That's not just calories in, calories out. That's a basic, your body's fighting weight loss. And why would that be? Well, one explanation from the carbohydrate insulin model is that we've reversed cause and effect. The fat cells are holding on to too many calories, and so there are too few for the rest of the body. That's why we get hungry. And until we address the problem, the fat cells storing too many calories, until we address that, weight loss is always going to be a struggle. But once we do address that, if we can take fat cells out of calorie storage overdrive, then there are more calories for the brain, more calories for the body, and it's easy to eat less. And it's easier to get more physical activity because we feel more energetic. There's more calories for the brain, but there's also more calories for the liver and the muscle and the other key organs. And what's driving this? The main issue, not the only issue, but the main issue is the processed carbohydrates. So it's not just to eat, one way of proceeding is to eat less carbohydrate, but another way is to eat the carbohydrates that digest more slowly. They don't have the surge in blood sugar that makes for all that insulin. And so these are carbohydrates that are less processed. So we're talking about grains, if you eat, so wheat, the actual wheat looks like a berry, like a little grain, wheat berries. Now, there's not a long tradition of this in recent Indian cuisine, but in the Mediterranean cuisine, you can eat a bowl of wheat berries, or you can have bread that is less processed, where you can actually still see little parts of the grain present. So it's less processed, less milled, as opposed to chapati. And I mean, I love Indian cuisine. I've traveled in India, but there's a lot of processed carbohydrates. White rice, naan, chapati, potato products, which do the same thing. And then we come to dessert and the gulab jamun, if I have that right, and all those. So we want to cut back on the processed carbs, and then we can either eat more unprocessed carbs, so whole fruits, especially the non-tropical fruits. So maybe not so much mango, banana, a little more apples, peaches, and the berries. Berries are really the best. They're very slow digesting. So fruit, whole fruit. Another is legumes, dal. So if you have, rather than having a big plate of rice and a little bit of dal, we want to have much more dal and other legumes and beans, and a little bit of rice, and better if that's brown rice. Now, there's not, again, a lot of long tradition of brown rice in Indian cuisine, but we can bring that back. Then also another way to help eat less carbohydrates is to make sure to get enough protein and tasty fats. So the protein is very important because protein produces another hormone called glucagon. Glucagon is right next to the insulin producing cells, and glucagon is the antidote to insulin. They do the opposite. Insulin promotes calorie storage. Glucagon helps pull the calories out of storage. Protein is the best thing to make glucagon. There's a fine tradition of vegetarian cuisine, which has also a spiritual purpose in India. And so you don't have to be heavy meat eaters to get protein. There are plenty of ways to do that with a vegetarian cuisine. So, eggs, certain kinds of dairy are high in protein. One very high protein dairy food is Greek yogurt. That's a wonderful food. And then we can borrow from East Asia, like China. Tofu doesn't have a long history in Indian cuisine, but it would be a perfect food to add. It's very neutral in taste, so you can include it with any kind of a regional cuisine. If you have a curry, it'll pick up the flavor of the curry. It's high in protein. And then lastly, enough fat. Fat is a neutral to the hormones. So we don't want to just eat the carbs and fat. We want to make sure to get the protein, and then the fat picks up the difference. It makes the food tasty. Olive oil, ghee. We eat ghee every day. Nuts and nut butters. another wonderful food is avocado. It's a new world food, but adapts beautifully to the Indian cuisine.
Lovely. Thank you, Dr. David. That was very informative, actually. So I think that that kind of sums up what I was trying to ask you. You know, how to add more fat. So we just add it as an additive to our regular cuisine that we are doing, just to.
Yeah, you don't necessarily need to get the fats very high. It depends. If you're wanting to, so there's many things in public health. If you do 50%, you can get 75% of the benefit. So it's not that you have to get rid of all carbohydrates. You know, carbohydrates are tasty. You know, they're abundant, but we want to cut back a bit. And so one way to make that easier, you know, we talked about cutting back and shifting to the less processed carbs, but by adding fat, then you don't feel hungry. The food is actually tasty and satisfying, and you won't be craving the carbohydrates. But if you want to, for people with diabetes, a very low carbohydrate diet may have special benefit. And the extreme version of that is keto, a ketogenic diet. When we get carbs below about 50 grams a day, and 50 grams is, you know, just a small, you know, if you just eat legumes and some dairy and nuts, you'll already get close to 50 grams. So, so that's a very restrictive diet. And for that diet, you have to eat a lot of fat. Fat needs to be your main source of nutrition. But that's a more extreme approach that's not needed for everybody. Although, again, for people with diabetes, there does seem to be some exceptional benefits. When you get down to very low carbohydrates, the body makes ketones. And ketones are like a super fuel for the brain. The body shifts from burning carbohydrate to mostly ketones for the brain. And people can describe a lot of benefits. Blood sugar very stable, insulin levels very low. The brain works very well on ketones.
Right.
But again, if you go to a ketogenic diet, you need some specialized guidance. You don't want to just start that by yourself. You know, there are some things that you have to do. You have to do it properly. And the transition from a regular high carb diet into a ketogenic diet, for a week or two, people may not feel very good. It's keto adaptation. So you need to, make sure you get enough salt and have the right balance so that you don't feel too badly. And you wouldn't want to tell a patient to do this and not give them good guidance.
Yeah, David, just a question to that. Sorry, Kapil, to interrupt, because we have started discussing the keto diet. Yes, you suggested that it's a good for the diabetic patient. But what about the obese? Is it good diet for obesity or it's not?
Well, I think that people talk about the ketogenic diet as a fad, and I think that's nonsense. There were many populations of humans going back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years who would have been eating a ketogenic diet as their main diet. Grains only entered human nutrition at most 10,000 years ago in any substantive amount. Yes, while we were hunter-gatherers, and we were hunter-gatherers for 98% of our time, as humans. Before that, you might have found a few grains if you were in a suitable location, but hunter-gatherers didn't eat grains. Now, they might have found occasionally some honey, and they would have had sugar then, but that would be an occasional feast. Hunter-gatherers in northern climates, where plants didn't grow for most of the year, they would have been eating ketogenic diets from hunting. And in northern Europe, in parts of Africa, like nomadic tribesmen in Africa, they still follow that diet. Humans require protein. We have to have protein. We have to have fat. Carbohydrate is actually the one of the three major nutrients that's totally optional. It doesn't mean that you can't be healthy with it, but you can live without it. You can live just with fat and protein. Humans have for thousands and thousands of years, much longer than we were eating grains. So conceptually, there's no reason why anybody couldn't do a ketogenic diet. That said, if you transition onto one, you need medical guidance. You need somebody like a dietitian or a doctor who knows how to do that, how to recommend it. And it's probably not necessary for most people, so why not have the maximum of flexibility? But for the people who have special metabolic problems, type 2 diabetes, and there's also some interesting preliminary data on some neuropsychiatric diseases, Alzheimer's, maybe even bipolar disorder. We know that ketogenic diet is exceptionally good for many children with epilepsy. The brain gets fed the energy balance of the brain is improved so that many children who can't be treated just by drugs alone respond well. Could that be true for some other disorders of the brain? It's a very exciting area of research. So to answer your question, yes, anybody can eat a ketogenic diet, but it may not be necessary, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I think the first step is to just cut back the processed carbs, get some more protein, whole carbohydrates, and plenty of healthy fats. And that may be enough to prevent that weight gain that you talked about, that occurs at 1 kilo a year. That change might be enough to prevent a problem.
Sure. So, Dr. David, is it just important about what we eat, or do we also need to look into when we eat? Does the timing of the food matter at all?
Yeah, well, I think Dr. Dhiren nicely demonstrated that tendency to eat every 3-4 hours on a high carb diet. What happens is, for many people, you eat the high carb breakfast. Whether if in France, in America, it's a sugary breakfast cereal and orange juice that the kids might have, and then if you have that at 7 in the morning, at 8 o'clock, your blood sugar is still surging and you feel good. Your blood sugar's up and your brain is temporarily happy, but too much insulin has been released. And you're going to be feeling good on borrowed time. So by 9 or 10 in the morning, your blood sugar is crashing, and then you're going to need those cookies, that snack that we give kids in the morning. It sounds like that's your morning tea in India. And so you keep doing this up and down, the sugar roller coaster. If you have a breakfast with more protein and fat and a moderate amount of carbohydrate, especially slow digesting, then you don't have that surge of blood sugar. You have a nice stable profile through the morning, and your insulin levels stay low. So you don't get hungry so soon, and your brain can function nicely without needing that morning pick-me-up. I think that spontaneously people will be able to eat less. They're just less hungry, and they stay full longer from their 3 main meals. Now, you mentioned Dr. Fung and intermittent fasting, and I would call those advanced principles. So don't start fasting, intermittent fasting, or time-restricted eating on a high-carb diet. That's a recipe for failure. As you pointed out, people can't even go from breakfast to lunch without needing a snack. So how are you going to go for 16 or 18 hours or a day or two fasting? You'll feel terrible. That insulin. So the first thing to do is to start training your body. We call it, the subtitle of my book, Retrain Your Fat Cells. We've got to take the fat cells out of excessive storage mode. by lowering insulin. And so that's just this shift from a high carb to a moderate or a lower carb diet, a little more protein, a little more fat. Once that's happened and you've adapted to that, then you can try intermittent time-restricted eating. So in time-restricted eating, which I do, and I love to do this, you typically don't have breakfast. And one thing that makes it easier to do is a cup of strong coffee or good strong tea in the morning with caffeine, if you can tolerate it. What the caffeine does is caffeine is lipolytic. It helps pull calories out of fat cells. This is well documented. When strong cup of coffee, if you follow your blood for the next few hours, your free fatty acids and your ketones will start going up. And that's an alternative fuel. Your brain can use them. And when that's happening, there's no hunger. So I have my strong coffee in the morning, equivalent to about 400 milligrams of caffeine. And I have no hunger all morning. It's just beautiful. I can work, my mind is clear. Then I have a very low carb lunch. So that's just how I do it. And then I feel, very happy to dinner. And then at dinner, I have, in the evening, I have whatever I want, some protein, some carbohydrate, relatively unprocessed carbohydrate, but I might have a half of a sweet potato and some berries in the evening. And so 2 meals is enough for me. But I could never do that eating a high carb diet when I was younger.
So according to you, like this low carb diet is a support to intermittent fasting?
Yes, they're synergistic. But you have to, you don't start with most people, you don't start with the intermittent fasting or time restricted eating. You've got to start with the first step of just getting the basics, getting rid of the, all the processed carbs, bringing the insulin level down. And, you could do that for a month or two and see how you feel. For many people, that's, when I took that first step in my 30s, I got rid of all of the weight gain I had from high school. I'd been gaining a kilo a year, or maybe a pound a year, half a kilo a year. And that first step was enough in my 30s and 40s to keep weight stable. Then you reach 50 and then things start to creep up again. And so at that point, to keep my weight stable, I brought the carbs down even more. I didn't eliminate them necessarily, but I brought them down more. And I started time restricted eating. So for me, even through the pandemic, I could manage my weight without hunger.
So is that a long-term way of living, according to you? Do you think it's sustainable long-term, the intermittent that you're talking about?
Again, everybody doesn't need to be doing intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating. Time-restricted eating is what I described, where you might, you have your evening meal, maybe it's 6 or 7 in the evening, and then you don't eat until maybe 11, 12, or 1 the next day. So all of your eating could be 8 hours out of 24. So that's called 16-8, 16 fasting, 8 eating. Or even more so, you could do 18 hours fasting and 6 eating. So there you might have your first meal at 1 p.m., your last meal at 6:30. And if you want, you can have a snack in the middle. So that gives your body a lot of time where it's fasting. The liver empties out of, it burns a lot of fat. But again, everybody doesn't have to do that. That style works well for my family and my culture because, a lot of people eat breakfast very quickly. That's not a big social meal, although it may differ in some cultures. The big social meal is in the evening. And so this way, you get to have an even bigger supper with your family. So that, I think, works well for people. But you want to adapt this you're going to have to adapt this to your own culture, your own family, and also your own culinary preferences.
Certainly. Yes, Dr. Dhiren.
Yeah, we have taken the two important things, the low carb diet or the low glycemic index diet, intermittent fasting or time restricted meal. The third component is exercise. So how do you look exercise, or what is the role of exercise in reducing the weight?
Yeah, exercise is very helpful, physical activity. But again, we have to set ourselves up for success, not failure. Somebody with major obesity, okay, they might have shortness of breath just walking up the stairs, joint pain, and they don't feel very good. You know, they tire easily. We're going to tell these people to walk 5 miles a day, let alone, you know, bicycle, run, and so forth. Let's start with getting the diet in place, and then, you know, very gentle, you know, very gentle walks. We start some weight loss happening that way, and that takes a little pressure off the joints. People feel a little better, but importantly, their muscles are being better fueled. Remember, as Dr. Dhiren said, the calories, if they wind up in fat cells, they're not going to be available for the muscle. But you close down that storage tank a little bit, you'll have more energy for the brain and the muscles. You'll feel more interested in physical activity. You know, when people go on a low-calorie diet, they're exhausted. They just want to collapse on the couch. And that's not a good setup. So we get the diet in place first, so people are less hungry, they're more energetic, and then they're spontaneously going to want to exercise, and we can promote that, encourage that, and then that creates a synergy. The other key piece that I'm happy to see you mention is sleep and stress reduction. So if somebody is sleep deprived, they're not going to be able to follow a diet very effectively. And if they're under a high level of stress, you know, maybe there's some major problem in the family. Maybe there's a woman. I'm with a group, a very wonderful group in the United States called Saheli, which is a group for women, anybody, men or women, who have been subjected to abuse, domestic violence, or they have, you know, major stresses in their life relating to immigration. You know, so if a person is in a bad relationship and feeling highly stressed, or they're subject to, you know, they've been physically, they feel unsafe, how are they going to pay attention to their diet? How are they going to prioritize physical activity? So sometimes we have to care for the individual first. And we relieve those sources of stress, we help them, and then they can take the next step.
Okay. And another question is, which is like a lot of people, they read on the media and then they ask us that there is a new molecule which has been available in India for last 2-3 years. That's a semaglutide.
Semaglutide.
Semaglutide. So no doubt it's used for overweight people, but what do you see that molecule as a future? Like, will it be available to everyone? No, the cost will definitely go down, but is it wise to use it easily or freely for weight reduction?
Yeah, semaglutide is an analog of GLP-1. That's a gut hormone, which interestingly goes up with a low carb or a low glycemic index diet. When you eat foods that digest more slowly, you produce more GLP-1. GLP-1 is made in the gut a little bit further. The further down you get the food, the more GLP-1 you get. So you can get some of the advantages of this without the costs of the drug just by eating this way. Now, the analogs are very, very potent. They're more effective than drugs that we've had in the past. And they have a very good safety profile based on what we know so far. One of the main consequences is excessive satiety. Satiety is that sense of fullness. People you take the drug and like they get nausea. They get nausea and vomiting. You can see that their mechanisms are related. The big issue is that there aren't enough of this drug, even for people with diabetes who most need them, let alone for people who have obesity right now. In the United States, it's not only it's hard to get, but it's also very expensive. $1,400 a month. What is the ratio of rupees to dollars right now?
Yeah, $1 is around 80
82, I
rupees.
think.
Yeah.
Okay. So
That comes to
so
1 lakh rupees
like
per month.
that's 1 lakh rupee. 100,000 is a lot.
100,000, yes,
So
100,000.
we're talking about 1 lakh rupee per month. Okay, that's in
Yes.
the United States. It might be, so I don't know about the availability of the cost, but we want to think of these drugs as tools, but not the front line of treatment. You know, we've got to have diet being the front line treatment.
Yeah, but the problem is like people want a easy solution and they really don't want to cut down on the
Go through
calories.
the hard way. Yeah.
Well, I don't want them to cut down on the calories. You know, you summarize that well. We don't focus on the calories. We focus on the quality of the food, and people discover that they don't have to be hungry, that they actually get more enjoyment from their food. But it does require readjusting, you know, some expectations that a diet that's, you know, a big bowl of white rice with some naan and potatoes and glubjaman, whatever, you know, that's never going to be a sustainable way to eat and maintain health. That we can get a lot of enjoyment from more savory foods, protein, healthy fats, and some carbohydrates that you'll still get to enjoy, but we need a different balance. So that's conceptually a lot easier than asking people to go hungry. And it does take a culture shift. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to take a pill and do everything the same, but even if it causes weight loss, are you still going to be at risk for other problems? And we don't know what taking this drug, even if you can afford it, we don't know what the costs, the potential side effects could be in 10 or 15 years. Once you stop taking the drug, the weight comes back.
So, Dr. David, just maybe I think we're getting towards the end of our time. So maybe a concluding question. So we've all seen that, you know, once you're on this kind of a weight loss journey, fat loss journey, one tends to plateau after a while. And I don't know if the BMR is slowing down or what's happening in the body, which kind of, you know, just stops you at a point. And you have any strategies or any tips for overcoming these kind of plateaus?
Yeah, well, sometimes again, it does. You have to add additional supports, you know, and we have to take this on an individual basis. It may be that you've made a moderate change in your diet, you're doing really, really well, and suddenly you start gaining weight, and then you say, oh, wait a second, I've been working too hard. And that's caused me to get stressed. I'm not sleeping enough. And you know what? I've got to reprioritize. That's a sign. My weight coming back, my weight gain is my body telling me a message. Hey, I need something different. I need some more attention. And then if you just ignore it, when we ignore our bodies, they have a way of talking to us louder and louder. And if we keep ignoring it, then sometimes the alarm bell of getting diabetes or getting a heart attack forces us to pay attention. So we want to pay attention to these alarm bells early. So sometimes it may just be a matter of getting better sleep, getting a little stress, getting a little more physical activity. Or it may be a sign that, we're a little older, our metabolism is shifting, and we need to take the next step. And for me, that a very effective next step was time-restricted eating. I didn't need it when I was 30. It's very useful, after 50 for some people.
Sure. Dr. Dhiren, yeah.
Yeah, David, one thing which I observed, for 3 decades, the medical community is telling the society that reduce fat, particularly the saturated fat. Now we are trying to tell them that it's not the fat, but it is the high glycemic food which we need to avoid. And you can take fat in enough quantity or sometimes more to replace the carbs. So a lot of people have a resistance to this idea that still for 3 decades, it's been in their mind that fat is bad, fat is bad. So to tell them that fat is a friend, it's a tough thing for us. So do you face such challenge in USA?
Yeah, mindsets are hard to change, but they do change over time. And I think people are recognizing that the low-fat diet era was a total failure in the United States and around the world. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily all fats are alike. You can eat a low-carb diet that emphasizes unsaturated fats, olive oil, nuts, avocado. These are all everybody, in the United States now and increasingly around the world recognizes these are heart healthy. However, our research suggests, and others as well, that when you cut down on the processed carbs and the total carbs, the adverse effects of saturated fat are reduced. It's very unhealthy, and I will agree, to eat a lot of processed carbs and saturated fat. So bread, white bread, and butter is not a good combination. But when you cut back on the sugar and the starch, the saturated fat gets burnt quicker in the body and doesn't stay around to cause much trouble. So I think that if you cut back, some sources of saturated fat are delicious, like butter and ghee, and cheese. So if you cut back on, like when we talk about bread and butter, 40 years ago, we said the butter was the problem and we ate more bread. I think I would reverse that. If you cut back on the bread, then you have the opportunity to enjoy, the saturated fats. Although again, you can eat a low carb diet with plenty of unsaturated fat if your cardiologist tells you to.
David, we have received a question from USA. One of the viewer from USA asked us a question that she is.
So the question has gone from USA
to India.
Now it's coming back to me. I'm going to send it to you, and then you'll send it back to the USA.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So the question is. If a patient is type 2 diabetic and is on insulin, how this carbohydrate insulin theory is going to help or is going to work?
Well, I think this is you don't have to believe in this particular model to understand that there is a very strong data in support of a low carb diet for diabetes. What is diabetes? Well, we define diabetes as a state of carbohydrate intolerance. That's how we define it, right? You consume carbohydrate, typically to control it, we use glucose tolerance test, and you see your blood sugar goes too high. It can't come down. That is diabetes. Your body cannot tolerate carbohydrate. Now, so if your body can't tolerate carbohydrate, what's the sense of having a high carbohydrate diet, right? If you have lactose intolerance, you don't tell the patient to consume a lot of lactose. You say a low lactose diet. So if you have carbohydrate intolerance, a low carbohydrate diet looks pretty good. You can keep a nice stable blood sugar. You could use less insulin. The less insulin you need, the better. The more insulin you take, the more likely you will fuel the fire with weight gain, more insulin resistance, and the more likely you'll get complications like hypoglycemia. So less carbohydrate, less insulin, and that may help weight loss. And then with weight loss, you need even less insulin. And so that can ultimately, in ideal situation, conceptually can help people actually experience remission from diabetes. If the beta cells of the pancreas can revive itself enough, we've seen, many cases of this. People who've had diabetes for years, type 2 diabetes, can go into full remission on a low carb diet. You can do that on a high carb diet with a lot of weight loss, but I think that's a rarer thing and it's a harder thing to do.
Thank you, Kapil. Now I hand over to you for the comments and the vote of thanks.
Right. So thank you, Dr. Dhiren, for an excellent talk, and thank you, Dr. David Ludwig, for sparing your time on this weekend and being with us and sharing your thoughts and your ideas on how we can manage this real big epidemic of obesity. And I thank OrthoTV for their collaboration with us and for streaming this webinar live tonight. So I think we'll end with that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.